Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the editor of the comics and pop culture site Popverse. It's Graeme McMillan. Thanks for coming on, Graeme.
I love that you said editor with such a sort of gasp. It's still new for me as well. I've only been doing it for months now, so yeah.
It is a pretty, significant difference. I mean, before you were, I don't know, it was staff writer? Was that your title?
I was staff writer for a couple of years. Before that, I was freelance for 13 years. So it is a change to what I was doing before this, certainly. It's a fun change. It's a surprising change. It's one of those things where I thought I knew what I was walking into, and I was 50% right. But the other 50% is fascinating.
It is kind of interesting to think about this because you've been doing this for how long? You said 13 years before this, but I mean...
I've been working as a professional writer for 22 years now.
And how many of those years were you at one place exclusively?
Outside of Popverse, there was a couple of years at IO9 and that was it. Everything else, I've been working for multiple outlets at the same time.
How different is it knowing where you're going to sleep at night, so to speak?
Oh, it's amazing. It's so good. Like I said, I was 13 years freelance before I joined Popverse as staff writer. And the last couple of those years in particular there was, the pandemic era, right? And journalism changed a chunk just in those, 2-3 years. And so I went from being very lucky and having a lot of opportunities for people who wanted to talk about pop culture, want to talk about comic culture, want to talk about genre entertainment, and were willing to pay. We're willing to provide a space to talk about this in an offbeat manner, because I did not write, and I still don't write, in a way that's like algorithms. Let's do SEO. Let's 100% go after what we know is going to be hit. And then, 2019, 2020, that changed drastically, it changed significantly. And it became much more of a hustle to stay afloat, to keep doing it as a career. And so, yeah, the idea of having a staff writer gig was, like I said, knowing where you're going to sleep at night was an amazing relief. It's also a different job, right? I was able to say no to things more often when you're freelance.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also the things that you end up doing when you're freelance that you really don't want to do, but you have to make rent. You have more say as a staff writer in the policy, for want of a better way of putting it, in actually shaping the direction of the site you're working for. And that was not always the case when I was freelance. But at the same time, when I was freelance, primarily for those 13 years, I was working for The Hollywood Reporter, for Wired, for Time, for Playboy, like mainstream outlets that would also cover this other material that I was covering.
Mm-hmm.
And you write differently for those audiences.
Well, and I think one of the things that's interesting about this, now, just to give listeners some background, so Popverse had a bit of a transition. Tiffany Babb left. Her title was deputy editor, wasn't it?
Yes.
And so she stepped out. She's going back to the freelance life. And there's a version of this world where Popverse simply didn't replace that role and didn't have like another person where they had a salaried position where they did that and had like somebody set in there. And instead, they hired you as the editor. When I wrote about it, the thing that I said was that is a really good thing because this is a really complicated world that we're existing in where sites aren't paying for comics coverage and sites aren't paying for nerd news coverage. And if they are paying, they're not paying a lot, not always paying reliably. And so keeping those jobs active, keeping those jobs in the mix, that's a really huge thing. And also, you're good at what you do. I've seen you live blog a panel before, man. You're a killer.
I love that you love the live blog thing so much.
Seriously, so listeners, okay, I was at the Three Worlds, Three Moons, whatever, secret panel, the panel they were doing at Emerald City Comic Con for people who are a certain level of backer there. And it was Jonathan Hickman, it was Mike Huddleston, it was Mike Del Mundo. My wife and I were there, and we were sitting, and Jonathan Hickman is up there, at one point making fun of me, I want to point out, which was really great. And he was talking, and everyone was like asking all these questions. And my wife and I were just sitting there staring at Graeme live blogging this thing, be like, this man is a machine. How is he doing this? He's not human.
I'm blushing. Please, everyone know that I am blushing very heavily right now. I'm going to completely ignore the compliment because I'm Scottish and that makes me very uncomfortable. And instead get back to what you were saying before that, which is it is actually really important that these roles are available, are paid. Like you said, there aren't a lot of people paying real money for this sort of coverage anymore. And that's a shame. I've been doing this for more than 2 decades, right? I've literally been around, this makes me sound horribly old. I was doing this before the MCU was a thing. I was doing this before Marvel Studios was a thing. I've been there for the entire era before, during, and now I think we're in the after, where mainstream outlets, mainstream publications want to treat superhero comics and superhero comic culture as the dominant pop culture force that it is, right? And are willing to pay for it and are willing to actually spend time and money to take this seriously. And I do think that, I mean, a lot of things have changed in the last few years, even in terms of the actual, the movies, the shows, the companies themselves, a lot of things have changed. But I think that especially in the last few years, we've seen things sort of shift towards, everyone's talking about superhero movie fatigue or Marvel fatigue, especially in the last year or so. And you look at things like the Marvels didn't perform particularly well at the box office. Secret Invasion didn't perform well for Disney Plus. And I think that people are now like, well, what's the next thing? What else should we be paying attention to? And they're moving away from this, which in my view is a mistake. I would give it a year before things come back and people are going to be surprised by the DC stuff. I think Fantastic Four is going to be massive. I think Fantastic Four is going to be surprisingly big.
I don't think it's going to be surprisingly big. It is incredibly cast, and it's got a aesthetic to it that looks like it's going to be amazing.
I think it's going to be bigger than people think it is. I think it's going to, in the same way that you look at Furiosa this couple of weekends ago, people were talking about how that underperformed. I think Fantastic Four is going to dramatically overperform.
Well, one thing I think is interesting is I remember James Gunn when he was first kind of rolling out the slate for the DC movies and everything. And he said something about how there isn't superhero fatigue, there's bad superhero movie fatigue. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, look at X-Men 97. That show set the world on fire.
Exactly.
And everyone was talking about it. I mean, a great podcast, Pablo Torre Finds Out. He had a couple of ESPN writers on with him to talk about it and just how much they loved it. And how many things have you seen ESPN writers covering that's in the MCU and stuff outside of random references to the Thanos click and stuff like that? So I really think that James Gunn was onto something there where he said basically that it's not that people don't want to watch these. It's just that if they're not delivering, then why would they watch them? And so I think that Bob Iger coming on and being let's slow this down. Let's try to think this. I'm not trying to compliment Bob Iger, but at the same time, it does seem like that is more of a prudent decision. This is already more movie stuff than I thought we were going to talk about, but still, go.
No, but I think it also plays into the publishing, right? It plays into the comics because you really are at a point now where what is happening in publishing is shaped by what is happening outside of publishing. We know for a fact that, when Superman rolls out next year and the DC, I think it's called DCU, the DC Studios material starts rolling out properly, we're going to see publishing back that up. We're not getting a Supergirl comic right now. We will get a Supergirl comic by the time that film comes out. We're going to get more Green Lantern material when the show comes around. We're going to get, and DC, I think, has been fairly, I don't think they've been entirely open about it, but when you look at what they've been publishing and when you look at what's been coming out, you can basically see the trends. The most surprising thing is Aquaman didn't get a comic for his film.
I mean, did you see it?
Yeah, I did.
He does not deserve support.
Yeah, no, I was going to say. But Marvel does the same thing. It's no surprise that we're getting an X-Men relaunch at a point where Marvel is preparing to do an X-Men movie. Deadpool and Wolverine is a month away from release, and that's the same month that X-Men 1 is going to come out again. X-Men 97 just came out, so yeah.
So for listeners, Graeme and I are going to talk about the world of what we do, the comics, writing about comic space. I refuse to call it comics journalism. For some reason, I only call it writing about comics. I feel like that's more accurate for what I do. But anyways, for that space. But the main reason why he's on is, we're going to be talking about some current topics and trends in the comic world. I challenged him to come up with 5. I came up with 9. I think somewhere between the two of us.
I like your 9. I want to find out what your 9 are because I'm really, as a subscriber to your newsletter, as a subscriber to your website, I want to know what your 9 are. Because I want to pick your brain.
I think I actually have 11, to be honest. I have a super random list. But anyways, I do want to bring up something you're talking about. And it was a question that I actually was asked in my mailbag recently, where somebody asked me specifically about the idea that the movies and TV shows influence the comics. And we know that, Kevin Feige is the person who is at the top of the food chain for Marvel Comics, not just studios.
He is officially the chief creative officer of of the Marvel publishing arm.
And Dan Buckley said in an ICV2 interview that it's been the case for 18 months. So it's not like it's new. And so we know, like, to some degree, there's always going to be that combination. And like somebody was pointing to the post-Krakoa era, the Brevoort X-Men. We need a shortening of this. I don't know what it is. Brevoort
From the Ashes. It's officially called From the Ashes. X-Men : From the Ashes.
I refuse. It's not cool enough. I'm sorry. It's not cool enough. But anyway, so they brought this up and said that like it seems clearly influenced by X-Men 97, which everyone involved with the From the Ashes era, if you want to call it that, denies. And I am curious. This is just an opinion question. Do you think that inherently, naturally, universally, the media influencing the comics is a bad thing?
I am going to be controversial and say no, and I also don't think it really matters.
I also said no.
The idea that movies or media or whatever can influence comics and that it's a bad thing implies that comics have always been this pure art, which has never been the case. There's always been sales part of it. There's always been an editorial part of it. Why is there a problem that there is now an input coming from a different area? You know, the idea that there is a halcyon utopian past where comic creators could do anything they wanted, no matter what, is just bluntly not true.
Yeah, I mean, think about the fact that Secret Wars, the first one, came to be because they wanted to make toys. Or, let's see, the Transformers came to be because they had a deal to make toys.
But that's just it. Like, some of my favorite Marvel stuff are all the toy books. Hammer's G.I. Joe, Bill Mantlow's Micronauts, Wrong. Those are central comics from when I was a kid.
The Transformers was the reason why I started reading comics.
And they're all toy books. They're all from outside media, you know? And that's fine. And when part of it is we're all too old and we're all too smart, right? We're all too aware of, well, think about it.
Don't give me too much credit, Graeme.
You don't care when you're a kid that it's a toy,
yeah,
right? You're just like, I love this toy, therefore I love the comic. Yeah, I love the cartoon, therefore I love the comic. You don't think about, well, the synergy is coming in and it's stepping and everything. Don't get me wrong, there's times where the synergy is a problem, right? I, as an old school fan, will, to my dying day, get upset about the Hawkeye that exists in Marvel Comics now is demonstrably a different character from the Hawkeye that was around for the first 20 years of that character's existence, right? In almost every respect. And they try and bridge the gap and, you know, it's successful or not. But it's fine, you know? Like, there was no synergistic reason to change Speedball into Penance, and it still happened. It's not as if comics always makes the right choice, you know. And if we get, for example, the Blue Beetle run that we just had at DC, if we only got that because of the movie, that's great. I'm happy with that. If we got the Shazam book because of the movie, again, perfectly happy with that. I love what Mark Waid and Dan Mora did. Love what Josie Campbell's doing right now. You know, those are great things. Again, comics can make the wrong decisions all by themselves, and external forces can help make a right decision.
Now you just have me wondering where Penance is.
Didn't he turn back into Speedball? Am I making that up?
Can you really turn back to Speedball after living in like an Iron Maiden for like 5 years or whatever?
How long was Penance around? I feel like he wasn't even around that long.
It was a few years because he was in the Thunderbolts, remember?
Yeah, but Thunderbolts was immediately after Civil War.
I know.
I'm going to say Penance is 2 years, and then he was unpenanced.
I don't think I've seen him speedballing around in a while. So, but whatever. Somebody needs to retcon that guy into a happy guy because that was some tough times.
I was going to say, if anyone knows this, it's going to be the Stiltman obsessive in this conversation.
You know, I dabble in speedball, but I live a Stiltman life. My guy's drunk and leaning over back there if you can see him. But yeah,
I dabble in speedball is something you just said.
That's right. Who doesn't? Can you ever really commit fully to speedball, Graeme? I don't know. I don't think so. But the thing is like, so I brought this point up when that person asked me that question. I brought up this interview I did with Russell Dowderman about his Marvel Art of Russell Dowderman project, and he talked about how when he was a kid, there was two things he loved. He loved Batman Returns, specifically Michelle Pfeiffer's Catwoman, and he loved X-Men the Animated Series. And when he went to read the comics, it was the Jim Balent era, which was decidedly different, needless to say.
Yes, indeed.
And then the X-Men comics were familiar, that seemed like the same characters. And so because they were familiar, he became an X-Men fan, but he didn't become a Catwoman fan. He still is a Catwoman fan, but, you know, different level of it. And so it is interesting because like that crossover is like things that, like you said, we question, but it's things that make things easier for non-hardcore fans to get into it. It kind of reduces some of the friction points. And I do think that there's value in that. And I think that we're kind of puritanical about this stuff in a way that's kind of unnecessary.
It's exhausting. I mean, here's the thing. How many retcons of your favorite characters have you lived through? How many favorite eras do you have of your characters that are unrelated to who they are now?
Yeah, like Speedball.
Who doesn't love the club? I was going to say that, but then I was like, I remember buying Speedball's first appearance.
In Amazing Spider-Man, I've seen like 1 million of them for like $2 at this local comic collection. Every time I'm like, should I buy this?
I remember that, and I remember he's in a Marvel Age annual. I think it's number 4. But I bought Speedball issue 1 off the stands.
Nice.
Because no, that's not nice.
That's a good look. That's a good look.
That was a confused child who was like, I think I like this. I can't tell anymore.
All right, so let's get into some of the topics and for real.
Do you have a written list?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I want to pick topic number 4. I don't even know what it is, but I want to pick topic number 4.
Okay, topic number 4 is, man, you ruined we were going to flow in so nicely. How about we do that after we do that?
Okay, go.
So before we started recording, we were talking about the Krakoa transition, because the day we're recording this, which is Wednesday, June 5th, is the day that X-Men number 35 /
Uncanny X-Men 700 somehow, magically.
Something can be two things at once, including numbers and titles. But anyways, so X-Men number 35 / Uncanny X-Men number 700 ended the Krakoa era and began the transition into the Brevoort X-Men. You wrote a big piece where you read all of the fall of the House of X and the rise of Powers of X and X-Men Forever, and wrote a piece about it. So I'm curious, a Krakoa transition is like this moment where people are having like a great mourning of the loss of it and are a great fear over what's coming. How are you feeling?
I am feeling, after reading all of those comics in one sitting, exhausted.
An appropriate response.
I'm feeling curiously optimistic is not the right word. I think if you read all of those comics in one sitting or even close together, I'm trying to think of a way of saying this politely. It felt very rushed and it didn't feel organic. And so there is a sense of, well, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world if this goes away for a while. It's also comics, right? So this stuff will come back. 10 years down the line, someone is going to come in and be like, I think Jonathan Hickman's X-Men was the greatest thing ever, and I'm going to recreate this. It's just how comics work now. And I say this as someone who, there's moments I genuinely love in some of those comics. But I think as a whole, they arguably make their own argument for existing and for ending the Krakoa era.
Mm-hmm.
I said this in the piece in Poppers, but I think that the Hickman era was arguably too ambitious for its own good. And Jerry Duggan and Kieran Gillen and Al Ewing are given the task of putting the genie back in the bottle, which is essentially impossible. You can't do it. There are things that are set up. It's because I also reread House of X and Powers of 10, and then Inferno as part of this massive reread. There's things done there that you can't undo, that you just functionally can't undo. And then these poor people are like, well, but you've got to undo it, and you have, checks watch 6 months to do it in. Go. And so you get things like Fall of the House of X is just narratively a disaster. And that's not necessarily on Jerry Duggan as a writer. But so much has to happen off panel.
Mm-hmm.
For something that, as a series, has to include the X-Men getting out under the thumb of Orchis, getting themselves back together, beating Orchis, and then going to war with, I shouldn't say more, but people might be reading it in Marvel Unlimited and they don't want to spoil it. And then doing more things. Let's put it that way. Half of that happens off panel between issues. And you just have characters walk on and be like, I can't believe that the humans, we've beaten them so quickly. And you're like, when? Was that in a tie-in? I didn't know. What happened?
The entire fight of Krakoa, like this big battle, pretty much took place entirely off panel. And it kind of reminded me of that part in, was it The Rise of Skywalker, where Poe Dameron is like, and then Palpatine returned, or whatever he said.
Yes, exactly. Somehow Palpatine returned. It is. It's half of the wrap up of the Krakoa is somehow Palpatine returned. And also, I don't know about you, because you've been reading all this stuff the whole time along, same as I have, right?
When I say all this stuff, I mean a focused, not all of it.
Oh, sure. Yeah. How much of what you were interested in from the Krakoa era was actually about the Dominion?
I mean, given the fact that it pretty much showed up in Powers of 10 and then effectively never showed up again until it started becoming a big deal again, not a lot.
Yeah, so it's really weird that so much narrative space of the wrap-up is devoted to a concept that has been absent for realistically 3 of the 4.5 years of this era.
Mhm.
And it is so much of it. And I know that people responsible for these books would argue with me about this. I also think they changed the rules about it from what it was introduced to the way it was wrapped up.
Are you talking about the Dominion?
Yeah, and that feels like a narrative cheat. I feel that the Dominion as introduced are one thing, and then in this wrap-up, they become something else because you can beat something else.
Sure.
And as Hickman introduced it, you can't. And it's actually explicitly said that it's unavoidable and that it cannot be defeated. And so to then go, but really, it's this guy over here, and you can defeat him by trying really hard.
I did really like the part where all the other Dominions showed up and they were just like, we're really just here to wish you best of luck, Jean Grey.
Yeah.
Good luck. We're rooting for you. This guy sucks.
Yeah, this is going to go well. Okay, bye. Yeah.
It is fascinating because I think really you can look at Moira as a microcosm for the whole thing. And how that character was handled, because let's be honest, as much as we want to look at this as the Krakoa era, the inciting person for the entire thing was the reveal of what Moira was in House of X #2. And everything that came from it, whether it's Krakoa and everything else, was built on her as a foundational element. And she fundamentally, in a lot of ways, was a foundational element that never really paid off.
She is put to the side, essentially, for the wrap-up.
I mean, almost for the totality of the entire run. I mean, really, besides when she showed back up during Inferno and like during the Mystique and Destiny stuff leading up to it. But I mean, here's the thing, though, is I consider it a success overall, like the Krakoa era, because it did result in a lot of interesting stories. And fundamentally, these things are designed to create storytelling environments where people can write and draw and do all these things. I think there was a lot of interesting stuff. I think it also ended poorly, generally speaking, even though I actually think X-Men 35 was good.
I think X-Men 35 was actually really good and far better than the issues that preceded it, if that makes sense.
It did seem like they put all their eggs in that basket in some ways. It felt so tight and precise as to what its goals were versus everything else, which was like, holy shit, we got to get everything done as fast as possible.
But that's just it. Like, the rest of the books do feel like that. The rest of the books really do feel like we have 5 months and we have to get this done. And so what do we have to do and what do we have to sacrifice to get there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is one day, I think Dave Busing from Comic Book Herald and occasionally Popverse once put it as like, there will be a very interesting oral history to come out of how this all went down.
Oh, yeah.
At some point.
100%. I do wonder, to talk about Moira, I do think that Moira was almost sacrificed. I think that if you can look at this era, the Moira era, the Krakoa era, whatever you want to call it, and there is a 3-act structure, that Moira's 3rd act just doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because you have Moira is the one who starts it. She has the 9 lives. She's on her 10th life. There is explicitly, in a scene that appears in 3 different comics, it's repeated in 3 different comics, and Destiny says, you get 11 lives if you make the right choices.
Mm-hmm.
So they're explicitly laying the groundwork of she has to die again.
Well, I mean, isn't in some ways like the conclusion to Rise that 11th life in theory, I guess? Wink, I don't know.
No, I think that's a stretch, because what I was going to say is I think that the depowering Moira in Inferno is the end of another act, but Storm was depowered and gets her powers back, right? So you have the structure of Moira's going to get her powers back. There is going to be another reset at some point. And then I think other minds stepped in and arguably justifiably went, you can't say that 4 years of X-Men comics is an imaginary story.
Yeah.
Especially when you've tied at that point, you have tied the other Marvel books in.
Counterpoint, she was real mad and a robot at that point, so she can do whatever she feels like.
But she was made a robot after Hickman left. Again, I think that Hickman had a plan where she's getting her powers back. And then, because immediately after Hickman goes is when they turn her into a robot.
Oh, God, that was after. For some reason, I mashed that up into Inferno. Well, okay, so here's what I want to say, though. I do think that I think X-Men 35 did an amazing job of putting all the toys back in the basket.
Yes.
And you're right, because it set everything up. I don't want to get into it because, again, spoilers, but I do think it did a really good job of setting up somebody bringing the second Krakoa age and like unlocking all of these toys so someone else can play with them again. Because, fundamentally, these things aren't useful until they are again. And right now they're not useful. Yeah. And I know that a lot of people don't want to hear it. I think that it was time for the Krakoa era to end. I don't know what these comics are going to be. I don't know what the Brevoort era is going to be. I think that it could be good. I think right now I'm not crazy excited about it, but there's so many comics I've been uncertain of that I end up really loving.
Yeah. Counterpoint is also, it doesn't matter if you don't like it as long as other people do. We don't have to like everything. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, I have to like everything. Speedball.
I'm glad. But I like my taste. I trust my taste. I don't have to like everything. And if other people like stuff and I don't like stuff, that's great. I don't want my taste to define everything. I don't want my taste to limit something. So it does feel very retro, the Brevoort era, and intentionally so, right? They're going, what are the big things? The school. Okay, we've got a new school. Hated and Feared. Okay, we've got a new Hated and Feared book, like the superhero book. And that's fine, but also, like, I've read those comics. Do you know what I mean? But also, I can go and read other comics. I don't have to keep reading X-Men and complaining about it. I can just give up for a while. I wasn't reading X-Men before X-Men came back on.
Yeah. They're also going to be in Merle, Alaska, which I'm 99% certain, as a person who lives in Alaska, is not actually a place. But more power to them.
Let me tell you about being Scottish and reading Muir Island stories for my entire childhood.
You've never summered in Muir? You've never summered in Muir, Graham?
Yeah, and every time they're like, let's go to Edinburgh with its famous cobbled streets. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think it ended well. I'll be really interested to see how it carries over. The thing is like, I think that people are always fearful of these transitions. I just wrote an oral history of Avengers Disassembled, and that was a perfect example of how fearful people are of this. And I think a lot of times people say that they're not going to do it, but I think that most people will give the next era a chance.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
The question is, will it deliver? And I have no idea. The only people who know are the people who are making it. And it'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think they'll launch well, obviously. It's a new era for the X-Men.
Yes. I think it's going to launch well. It also, I don't want to say it doesn't matter if it doesn't deliver, which sounds very cynical, but it doesn't, because then they'll come up with something else.
Yeah.
The X-Men comics are not going away.
No, they're not.
So if it doesn't work, then someone will come up with something else. That's what happens. This is not, I don't know, Kirby having the Force World cancelled underneath him, and then it doesn't come back for 10 years.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Looking for the right place to read digital comics? You can find it at Omnibus. Omnibus is a modern digital comic book store and reader app carrying your favorite single issues, volumes, and omnibuses all day and date. It's just like a comic book shop where you pay per book, but digital. And the team at Omnibus has massive news. It's now available everywhere, including iPads, iPhones, Android devices, and its web reader. However you want to read comics, you can find it on Omnibus and all in your pocket. Looking for an ideal digital comic book store with an excellent shopping and reading experience? One that uses novel discovery features that helps fans find their next new favorite book, and one that features many of the best publishers, including Image, Boom, Dark Horse, and more? You can find it all on Omnibus at omnibus.app. And now, back to the show. All right, so my fourth topic, the one you picked originally, fourth topic / trend, is not as universal. It's just something that I find really interesting. I'm sure you've seen this. 8 million people that draw comics have posted recently that they've joined Kara or or whatever.
Yes, I had a whole thing because I saw people on Blue Sky, which is itself a relatively new social platform.
Extremely new.
Everyone going, I've joined, and here's a screenshot, but they didn't say what they joined. And I simultaneously had the, what if you all joined? And I'm so tired, I'm not going to do another one.
Right.
I'm just not.
My fourth topic was social media destruction / newsletters. And the thing I think is interesting about this is, let's count down. There's the original, Twitter / X. There's Instagram, which is now AI Haven, apparently, which is super awesome.
It is? Okay.
I think that's the whole fear, is that they're now going to take art and they're going to, I don't know, it's complicated, man. AI, let's just say that. Blue Sky, Mastodon, I guess. Threads, I hate Threads. Threads sucks. Let's see, Kara. There's all these different things. There's fracturing of all this stuff. All the while, I can tell you firsthand, this stuff is just devastating any traction and engagement any of this stuff really gets.
Yep, that's the thing about working in comics journalism, as I will call it, and you won't.
It's called writing about comics, Graham.
One of us is up for a Comics Journalism Award, and it's not me, so maybe you might want to rethink what you're doing, my friend.
Okay. I've been rethinking it for 15 years now, Graham. I'm still working on it. Anyway, sorry, continue.
Again, I also see how I don't want to say engagement, because that's one of those terms that just feels like, it's like saying, I produce content. That also makes me rankle. And from your face, I can see you feel the same. But the engagement is gone. The sense of community is gone.
Yeah.
The sense of being able to have one conversation that people will be able to plug in, and you'll have a diversity of voices and opinions, is disappearing. And that's really sad. I remember, again, this is me being old, I remember the comics blogosphere of the early 2000s, which was the first incarnation of this, right? Well, it wasn't really. You had like AOL boards and everything before that. But you had this thing where it felt like people were talking to each other and discovering each other and becoming friends through it. And that was an exciting thing. And Twitter was exciting originally. And there was a sense of expansiveness of that things are building towards, I don't want to say a better tomorrow because that's so cliched, but I do mean that. And nowadays it's entirely the opposite, right? It is, I'm talking to the people who are following me on this particular platform, but if I want to talk to the other people, they're on this other platform. So do I say the same thing, or do I say something else? Do I only concentrate on one platform? Who am I talking to? How are they going to find me? Are they on this platform as well? There's no single gravitational force that's holding everyone together anymore.
Well, and that's why I think it's interesting that newsletters have become such an emphasis. Actually, Matthew Rosenberg had a really great thread about this on fittingly multiple social media platforms because he had to post it so everybody could see it on all of them. And the whole thing was basically like, if you really love somebody's work and they have a newsletter, subscribe to that because that's the only way you know you're going to see it. And maybe that's a Patreon, maybe that's just on MailChimp or Substack or Ghost or Button Down or God only knows what else. There's probably a million of those too. I mean, there's at least 4. I just listed them. And they're migrating over in that direction. And so in a weird way, it kind of feels much more like that blogosphere era where everything is decentralized. There's no centralized point anymore like there was when Twitter was really kind of rising up and comics Twitter was kind of this defining element.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know what this means for everyone. And it's funny because this conversation has been going on basically since Elon Musk took over in like a year and a half ago. But I think it's really taken a step even worse lately. And I don't know what that means, but it's going to be really interesting to watch. And it's really going to change how things work. And it's really affecting comics marketing, to be honest. Like, I don't even know how you market comics anymore.
It's going to be brutal for comics marketing. It's going to be brutal for creators. This is going to really dramatically harm a lot of people's careers. It's going to force people out of comics. And I don't know what the solution is, because the solution isn't newsletters. I love newsletters. I am subscribed to far too many newsletters, an embarrassing amount, in part because I love the format. I do love the broadcast nature of it. I do love the idea that you can have someone who is just going to communicate whatever they're thinking about at that moment. And they can be as interactive or not as they want. You look at something like Grant Morrison's newsletter, where so much of it is this salon where, people are asking Grant questions and Grant answers. Or you have the short-lived Everlasting newsletter, which was basically, Tom going, I don't know what I'm doing. Fine, I'm just putting this out. Okay, okay, bye.
I like Exploding Giraffe. I like Brian K. Vaughan and Nico Henricon's one. That one's really good.
Yeah, that one feels like a nice balance between, broadcast and receiving.
As far as the newsletters go, it feels like a community.
Yeah, it is a malleable form, the newsletter. But also, I love, and this sheer laziness, I love that it's all coming to one place and it's coming to me.
Yeah.
And I don't have to search for it. Because that's the biggest problem with decentralization. That when it was just Twitter, you log on to Twitter and you see what's happening. When it's X and Threads and Mastodon and Blue Sky and Kara and Facebook, because people are still using Facebook, you have 5 different places just to see what someone is talking about. The VanCaf thing that just happened, last weekend as we're recording this, I had to go to multiple places to find out what was even happening, because I was only seeing the 7th iteration of the conversation where everyone's already speaking in the shorthand, but I couldn't trace back. There wasn't an easy way to trace back. What are you all talking about? What is this?
Oh my God. I hadn't thought about that before, because whenever there'd be the discourse would pop off in comics, I would always see the tail end of it, and I always be like, all right, well, I just gotta, if I really want to know, and eventually I just discovered I really don't want to know, but if I ever want to know, I just had to kind of go down a rabbit hole searching on Twitter, and I would find that. Mm-hmm. Now it's if you look at a screenshot from Twitter of something that then you have to track that down from let's say Blue Sky to Twitter, and then it turns out it originates from an article. You got to track down that article, and then that might have stemmed from somewhere else.
It's really difficult to follow a conversation now, because the cultural conversations, not the social media conversations, but the cultural conversations happen in multiple places. I think about when all the Ed Piskor stuff went down. That was happening in parallel. There was about 4 different conversations happening on different platforms that should have interacted, that should have built to a greater, larger conversation. because people would have seen opposing points of view, or they would have seen more context, or they would have seen something that might have changed the way they were responding in the moment. But without the central hub that comics Twitter was, you just had these separate conversations of people getting increasingly more entrenched in their position. And that's bad, you know?
It's really interesting to see how much, like on Blue Sky, for example, actually stems from like Twitter screenshots that somebody shares. And like, that's kind of like the jumping off point. I also think, I mean, like, this is something that I think is fascinating is because of this transition and because certain entities or certain examples of this have become so popular. Like before we started recording, we were talking about Tom Brevoort's newsletter. It is kind of fascinating. I was having a conversation with somebody recently about the idea that in some ways Tom Brevoort seems like the de facto head of Marvel because of his newsletter. And it's patently untrue. It's just not. He's the head of X.
He is the loudest public voice.
Exactly.
You don't get Dan Buckley, you don't get CB Cebulski like out there every week with the newsletter.
So people will look at that and they will take his word as gospel. Like he said in an answer to a question I had where I said, the vast majority of fans want more Stiltman. When are we going to, get more basically? And he said, he's always there. You just have to look up. So in my opinion, canon, Stiltman is always there. You just have to look up. So, I mean, it is interesting how like this stuff kind of colors the conversation. And like, again, it's from a really fractured perspective. And it's tough for creators. It's tough for marketers. It's tough for everybody. And like, I really think that as much as we have our own spaces and we let it be whatever it's going to be, it's kind of like scary what it's going to mean.
You do miss the public square nature of it, right? And I think back to, do you remember when, again, it was a pandemic, so maybe 2020, 2021, DC fandom was a thing?
Oh, I remember talking about DC fandom being a thing, but yes.
There was a point where it looked like companies were going to move away from the centralized Comic-Con to have their own individual. I mean, Disney still does. They've got D23, right? And they tried it, and then for whatever reason they've moved back to the centralized space. And I think it's because the centralized space, this public square, this idea that you have to be outside of your own bubble if you want to grow that bubble, you have to be outside of your own bubble if you want to reach new voices, is centrally important. And if we want comics to be a mainstream cultural force, I think it's going to fall on someone somewhere to invent a space where that is allowed to happen.
I also think that publishers cannot be so reliant on creators being their marketers because that's just not going to work anymore.
That's a conversation that's been happening for years, though.
I know.
It's not backtracked yet, And you look at companies where, the marketing efforts of comics is a very strange place right now. I joke often. You're going to San Diego for the first time this year, right?
I am, yeah.
I remember fondly, whatever year it was, 2017, I think, 2016, DC's Heroes in Crisis cruise.
Oh, boy.
Which was a real thing.
I would not want to be on that cruise.
To promote Heroes in Crisis, a large number of press, this isn't a small number, a large number of press were invited on board yachts where we were all given DC-branded robes.
Oh.
And we sat on the ground while Tom King explained what Heroes in Crisis was going to be. This was before the launch. Tom King explained what Heroes in Crisis was going to be, and there were there were people wearing masks, and like it was a thing that real intent and money had been taken to make this happen. And it was a comic. Like, there wasn't the movie. This wasn't a movie promotion thing. This was purely for a comic.
I gotta go on eBay later to find one of those robes.
I'm like, I wonder if I still have mine. I don't think I do anymore.
I would absolutely have it. I love a good robe.
It was a white robe that had the DC logo in gold on the back.
Oh my God, that sounds so amazing. If a DC rep still has one, send one to me, please.
Oh, I'm sure someone does. But no, like there was this era where like that was the norm. Mm-hmm. Where like the idea that we treat a comic as an event. As opposed to this comic is important because it ties in with this film, or this comic is important because, Keanu Reeves is writing it, or this comic is important because it's the launch of a new publisher. Instead, this is a comic that's just important. Like, we're going to spend time to promote it.
I'm going to give you two choices. We can build off of what you just said, or you can pick another number.
I'm going to pick another number.
Oh, you jerk. Go ahead.
Okay, no.
No, it's fine.
What would you say if we're building off, and then I'll pick another number anyway?
There's two things that I think are really interesting. So one is that there's a lot of I don't know, there's still doom and gloom out there about the direct market. I just had Steve Anderson on there, and Steve Anderson, he and I are always very aligned. And honestly, we both think that there's a resurgence happening to some degree right now that is more going to be felt in 2025. And that's at least in part on the strength of there being some real strong selling direct market comics right now. That ties into a second point, which is they're all built around lines, and not big lines, small lines. Ultimate, or the Ultimate Universe from Marvel, Energon, Ghost Machine. Those are all like, 4 books at a time, basically? And they're all doing really well. And I think part of the reason is because they focus people's attention on a few things. And then on top of that, they reinforce each other. It's like, oh, you liked, I'm not going to say Ultimate X-Men because that's a funny one, but Ultimate Spider-Man, well, then read Ultimates, and it's going to enrich that story, and it's going to enrich all of this. And so I do think it's interesting that I think they've I don't want to say accidentally, because clearly they built these with intent, especially Skybound, but I think that there's an answer to some of the problems that these publishers are facing. They just have to embrace it in a way that is very atypical for most of them.
Well, exactly, because I think the problem is small lines are great, but they will want it to be a bigger line.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, again, look at the X-Men relaunch. The X-Men relaunch is already at
8 million books,
8 or 9 books, yeah, which is wild for a line that is going to be 3 months old.
And I'm sure you know as well as I do that there's a fair number of others on the horizon.
Of course, yeah, but of course there are. That's just the way it works. Just today as we're recording this, another Avengers book has been launched. All of a sudden, we have a second Avengers title again. So it's just what happens. The companies are always going to want more.
I mean, it's funny to think back to the Krakoa era. Part of the reason why I think it did as well as it did is it started with 2 books that you had to read, and then it kicked things off into, I think, 6 other books. And even then that was smaller. But the fact that you just had to read 2 things, I think that was a core element as to why Krakoa was as big as it was, is you just had to read these 2 things and you're in. And they both rocked. To be honest, Ultimate is also good, and so is Energon. I haven't read Ghost Machine, so I can't speak to that.
I think Energon is doing the same thing, right? Where it starts with 1 book and you're like, oh, there's a Transformer in here. And then they do the Transformers comic and it ties in. But then that leads into the Duke comic, which leads into the Cobra Commander comic. There is the idea of like, they are playing against each other or playing with each other, but you don't have to read all of them. However, it is if you like X, you will like Y. You will also like Z thing. And I think that's the key, right? The key is a healthy publisher will be a publisher that has multiple of these small lines, but they're not expecting everyone to read everything.
Right. But is that something they're going to do? I mean, I know that Popverse just had that Dan Buckley thing, which I think was built off of his speech at Comics Pro, right?
I see. Comics Pro, yeah.
Yeah, so Comics Pro's annual meeting. I did think it was interesting. Question within a question. Why did you guys publish it in June when that was in February? I thought that was interesting.
Because we could.
Aha. That's a good reason.
The short answer is things are not, you don't always have to be the first. You don't always have to be the latest, especially if, for want of a better way of putting it, like a better thought comes to you later. There's nothing to stop you going back and being like, hey, wait, this happened. And it's still relevant. So why don't we talk about it now?
I mean, as a guy who publishes 1 feature a week and that's pretty much it, I get you. But anyways, yeah, it is. I do think that, like, looking at some of what he was saying, I think that Marvel's aware of that. I think DC's aware of that. Whether or not they can commit to it, because the problem is ultimately they answer to the people who pay the bills, the people who follow the books. And so if they went to them and said, I think we should only have 4 comics, and they're like, I think we need somebody else in your job.
Yeah, no, exactly. You're not going to get. I mean, Marvel especially has an exceptional number of comics every month. You're not going to find success by going back to Disney corporate parent and say, what if we half our line, but they will be better books, because the immediate response will be, will they sell twice as much? And you look at publishers trying different things. Like, for all intents and purposes, when Rebirth came along for DC, they did have their line. It's just they published them twice as often, right? And found success doing so, at least in the short term. But you're going to see, Marvel's doing a lot of giant size books right now, where it's, you like Fantastic Four, maybe you'd also like giant size Fantastic Four. Or Brevoort has said outright, the X-Men books are not going to be monthly. We're going to be doing increased volume of them because we can, because we want to sell more comics. And you will have demonstrated that you want to read Gail Simone's Uncanny X-Men. So you're not going to complain if you get 2 issues a month.
Yeah. I do love that amidst all this, like, Vault is just basically like in a mad science lab, cackling, just doing random shit. And I'm just like, more power to him.
Like Vault and Oni are doing like really interesting things. And it is, again, it like you said, it's just being like, well, what if we do this because it seems cool?
Yeah.
And some of it catches fire. Like Dwellings, I think, is one of the best things that I've read in the last year, you know? And some of it, like, again, it's not to my taste, and that's fine. But it's nice to see people who, for want of a better way of putting it, are doing things for the love of comics.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and also trying to find, and that's one thing I always appreciate about a Kirkman, is Robert Kirkman is always going to try to find new ways to do things. And sometimes that means that your comic that you created is now a Hasbro comic, which is what Void Rivals is, which is deeply fascinating to me. But I appreciate the experimentation because it's just such an uncertain market. It doesn't pay to like do the same thing over and over.
I would say very quickly, because you mentioned experimentation, I've told you before, I think, about my love of the surprise crossover that 2000 AD did, the UK Weekly.
I don't think so.
So about 10 years ago now, they did a story called Trifecta, which was, so 2000 AD is a weekly anthology and there's 5 stories every week, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they did a crossover between 3 of those stories and they didn't tell it. They didn't announce it at all. And what they did was, the stories all started at different times, and then one of them was the Judge Dredd story, which is the first story in every issue. And one episode of the Judge Dredd story ended with him kicking a door in. And the next page, which is the first page of the other series, features Judge Dredd kicking the door in from the point of view of the person inside the door.
Oh, wow.
And but they didn't tell you. You had to read the comic in that order to understand what was going on. And then a week after that, they added a 3rd series to it. But they didn't spell it out. You were just like, wait, I know that character's name. That character's name is in the Judge Dredd story. Is this the same story? What's happening? And it built for about 8 weeks. And then at the end of it, they were all telling the same story at one time. And it was genuinely was a secret crossover. You didn't know what was happening, but you also didn't need to buy any extra comics. They were all in the same comic. There's a level of experimentation that's a joy in its pure comics in that, right? Where you are just like, what if 3, because it was Al Ewing, Rob Williams, and Cy Spurrier were the 3 writers. And it grew out of them basically just being like, well, this is where we are with the Judge Dredd mythology. What if someone did this weird thing and then the 2 others were like, I want to play with that too.
Mm-hmm.
And they just did, you know? And again, without the announcement. Imagine if Sins of Sinister had happened in the X books, but no one had announced it.
Well, yeah. That'd be pretty
Do you know
crazy.
what I mean? Like,
you got 2/3 of the group there.
No, exactly, right? But imagine if you just did something like that and you did the stealth crossover, which, again, you know, Marvel and DC were doing back in the 70s. One of my favorite weird DC things is when Mantis shows up in Justice League because Steve Englehart's fallen out with Marvel and just takes the character whole hog over to Justice League.
Oh, my God.
And like finishes her story there in an entirely different comic. And she just makes veiled references to the Avengers throughout the whole thing. You know, that sort of stuff's great.
That's why I think it was interesting that Rom V and Dan Waters and everybody was doing the one hand and the 6 fingers.
It's the six-fingered hand and
the one hand and the 6 fingers. And I like that they were doing that where it's like two books that stand alone, but also are good together. And like, I think that stuff is smart. And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. The crowdfunding platform Zoop is growing. For the 20th anniversary of the Eisner-nominated Hack Slash, they have unleashed the first ever Zoop Games project, transforming the comic into a deck-building card game. If you're a fan of comics, horror, tabletop games, don't miss out. June is also headlined by the legendary Jim Starlin and the release of an omnibus for his classic series Breed, as well as Babylon 5's Claudia Christian's new release, Dark Legacies. If you ever wanted to own a piece of Zoop, now you can. They're wrapping up an equity crowdfunding campaign where your contribution earns you shares in the company, as well as other perks. Visit republic.com/Zoop to become an investor in Zoop. For creators looking to crowdfund your project or have your books for sale in Zoop's brand new e-commerce marketplace, email them at hello@wearezoop.com. And now, back to the show. Let's move on. Pick a number.
7.
7. Okay, publishers crowdfunding. So I think that there is a lot. I mean, it's been interesting to see. There's just been so many publishers crowdfunding to the point where I had a creator recently tell me that it's quickly becoming not a creator space, but a publisher space. And if you think about all the ones who are doing it, Boom Boom is doing it like crazy. You have Skybound doing it. I mean, they've done a number of things, but I mean, most recently they did the G.I. Joe Compendium, which instantly made like $87 billion or whatever. And then they had the Art of Extremity / the Extremity, whatever, Signature Edition, I think it was.
Yeah.
Oni is doing it. I mean, kind of everybody's doing it. Even like Marvel is kind of dabbling through Clover Press with those Marvel art books. And it's really fascinating to see. And the thing is like, I know some retailers who are kind of mad about it because they're just like, they're kind of cannibalizing our own audience. But then there's some other ones that are like, it doesn't really make that big of a difference. I just find it really fascinating because I think we're in this time where publishers, I mean, we talked about this already, publishers are trying to find answers. And I think that the whole embracing the crowdfunding platform world and like kind of invading that is just one of the many. But it is one of those things that you sometimes wonder if there's a double-edged sword both on the direct market and on creators and their ability to actually crowdfund stuff themselves. But I don't know.
It feels like invasion is a loaded term, right? But I do feel that when publishers crowdfund, they're not crowdfunding. They're using it as a pre-order service to sell direct to consumer.
Absolutely.
Because there's no way the G.I. Joe Compendium is not going to be funded.
That would be hilarious. Can you imagine? Like, oh God, I hope we get to $50,000. Oh my God.
But that would be awkward and horrible as well if it didn't happen. You'd be like, I'm so sorry. Like we thought it'd work. But Boom with the 10 and 10th anniversary books as well. Those are never not going to hit their goal. And the goals are at a level that they've got to. They're intended to. So it's a pre-order for direct consumer. I do feel ambivalent / nervous about that because I do think that there is an extent to which it is cutting the direct market retailers out of it. And those retailers have, in a very real sense, kept those publishers afloat for a very long time. Mm-hmm. Without the direct market, you don't have a Boom, you don't have an Oni, you don't have a Skybound. And so it's churlish and naive to say that they should always be beholden to each other. But it also feels slightly unfair that publishers can then just go, okay, but we're just going to go on Kickstarter and we're going to sell direct to them anyway.
Yeah.
There is, I mean, I was going to say there's got to be a solution. There is a solution. Many of these campaigns have retailer levels where retailers can batch order books and get a discount. That feels like a solution, but it also feels like you said, it runs the risk of taking what is ultimately a limited number of dollars away from other projects that otherwise will not exist. You are taking away from creators, you are taking away from smaller publishers. And Kickstarter all the crowdfunding projects are traditionally and importantly where ideas that would not get a direct market basis can at least do proof of concept.
Right.
And so the idea that they could be pushed out by other retailers other publishers rather, who are just looking for a different delivery method feels dangerous. But I mean, what about the comics industry? It doesn't feel dangerous.
Yeah, that's true. It's really fascinating because, I don't know, like the ones that are really interesting to me are ones like Boom did, I think it was the Expanse Dragon Teeth. And the thing that was interesting to me about that was most of them are collected editions. That was a single issue thing where you could pre-order the 12 issues through that and then they would send them to you as they came out. And that to me, I know Boom would disagree with this. I've heard from people who have disagreed with this. Felt like a shot across the bow of retailers in a real way because that is their product. That is the lifeblood of the direct market. Now, there is, again, the flip side of like, they do need to be finding answers that are not entirely reliant. And there are plenty of people who order stuff on Kickstarter or Indiegogo or Zoop or whatever that don't go to comic shops. And so you could be expanding your audience. So there's value in that.
Well, there's also the counterpoint of with something like that, you guarantee that all 12 issues are going to be published. Whereas in the direct market, you can launch big and then by issue 7, there isn't a market for it anymore.
Yeah. The question is, what does balance look like? And I don't think anyone really knows. It does seem like it has become a reliance upon it. But at the same time, when G.I. Joe puts up $1.6 million in 5 days or whatever it was, or 3 days, I guess I don't totally blame them because that's a lot of money. And money talks.
Well, it's also a promotional tool, right?
Right.
It's not just these books are coming out. You can now say, look how much money we made. How quickly. Like, there is a demand for this. This is what people are talking about. It is a shot across the bow of direct market. But again, so much is. Look at Distillery. That could arguably be a shot across the bow of the direct market as well. Or TKO Studios, remember?
Chip is going to be mad at both of us now. Thanks for that.
I know, but like Chip is a lovely human being who will forgive us both very quickly. I say that. I'm going to see Chip at like San Diego or something, and he's 100% going to give me shit for that.
Can I tell you a quick Chip story? So we're talking about Chip Mosher from Distillery, and like I always write my poll articles, and I talked about how I wasn't sure if I was going to get. They had the 3 new books that were announced last week: Time Awaits, which sounds amazing, and then The Missionary, and a third one, which name I can't recall. And I talked about how like sometimes I don't read them super fast because they don't fit on my nightstand because they're so big. And Chip literally commented, "Get a bigger nightstand, Harper."
I love that very much.
It was so funny. I read it to my wife. It was so funny. Anyways, so yeah, I mean, there's no perfect answer. I think that's like something that's circling all of this is it's a time of transition.
Well, but go back. It's always a time of transition is the thing. Go back 20 years to the internet when the internet is the Warren Ellis forum and the comic blogosphere. And you have people 100% saying the floppy should die, the direct market should die, it should all be in bookstores.
I have like 9 straight years of podcasts where Heidi McDonald said the floppy's dying right now.
No, right. But you go like 10 years back and people are like, well, it's digital. Like it's always flux. It's always changed. There's always a magic solution that no one knows what it is and everyone's trying something. Mm-hmm. I think what's happening now is there are so many different things that people are trying. At the same time, as you said, the direct market is actually not in a bad place right now. It's so counterintuitive to say that because so many people almost want it to be in a bad place, or at least want to be doomsaying about it.
I think it's actually in a recovery mode right now. I mean, I know that there's some shops that are not doing well, and that is not fair to me to say, but I do think that there are signs that there's a turnaround happening to some degree. We're not going back to the pandemic boom.
It's also a very difficult story to tell because we have so many different distributors now and no one's actually really talking sales figures. So, we have to just take it on people's say-so to something successful, which ironically is why something like a Kickstarter is good because
you can say it did well.
You can say, look, there's 1.6 million in 5 days.
Yeah. You can go to Barnes & Noble and say, this is how much demand was there.
Yeah, it's a recognizable metric in a way that understandably publishers are not going to say, because they don't want to say, we think we're doing great and we're selling X, only to have another publisher be like, oh, you think that's good? Because we're selling 2X. So everyone's going to keep everything in a way that, I'm really happy we do not have a distribution monopoly anymore. Mm-hmm. But when everything went through Diamond, we had a sales chart that we could see how sales were comparing.
Yeah. With everything based around Batman, of course, which I always thought was hilarious.
Yeah.
Batman, number 100. I love it. Okay, let's speed through to another one. This ties into it. One of my favorite things, and I wish I saw more people talking about this because I think it's awesome and I think it's super smart. One solution I think that people have come up with is finding new ways to use old material in interesting ways. So new formats of old comics, like the DC compact comics. I think that is smart as hell. $9.99, totally built from the Nomad line from Urban Comics. Shout Francois. He's probably listening. You're the best, man. Francois from Urban Comics and his team came up with the Nomad Comics line, and they converted it to DC Compact Comics. I've seen retailers talk about that's going to kill. I think that's going to do really well. The Saga Digest editions. I think the Saga Digest editions are going to do awesome, and I think they could introduce to a completely new audience. Also, all the compendiums Image and Skybound are doing, they as soon as they said Revival was coming out with a compendium, I'm like, they got something else coming. And then they announced the show, and I was like, of course they did. And so they got all these different compendiums. I would not be surprised if Image in the next year announced compendiums and or digest for like pretty much every book of theirs. And every long running book.
Why would you not?
Why would you not? That is a perfect question, Graeme.
Look, I'm not going to answer because I'm in agreement with you. If you have the material and people want the material, why don't you make the material available in every format you can?
Well, and it makes it more discoverable for different audiences. Because here's a good example. My nephew loves comics, but he does not want to read incomplete stories that he has to buy 50 different books for. If he can get a compendium of Revival, I bet he would love it. Because Revival's a great comic. Mike Norton and Tim Seeley killed it.
I will give you a counterpoint to that. My kid will not read basically a large book.
Oh, interesting. Just tankobons and stuff like that?
Yep.
Then they got the digest for him.
But also, he likes single issues.
Oh.
There's something for him about being able to finish. But like your nephew, he doesn't want to read an incomplete story. Mm-hmm. Like, he will read single issues if he has them all. Do you know what I mean?
That is fascinating. Yes, I know what you mean, but it is a interesting picture you're painting there.
But all of those, like, the reader preference is so varied.
Yeah. But the point is given options.
Yes, create something so that everyone can get it.
Yeah.
And it's funny that for all the people complaining about, Watchmen continues to sell, Watchmen is available in almost every damn format that's ever been existed.
Absolute.
Do you know what I mean?
Digest very soon, like varying different like soft covers.
Yeah, the paperback, the different hardcovers, the deluxe hardcovers, the oversized hardcovers, the artist editions.
You know what they've never done? I don't think they've facsimiled it. I can't believe they haven't facsimiled it. They facsimile everything.
Are they worried about getting an Alan Moore curse again?
I don't know. I mean, I think they've been cursed enough for a lifetime, to be honest.
You're like, at this point, who even knows? I don't know. I mean, if it was a Marvel book, I was going to say if it was a Marvel book, they'd facsimile, but they didn't facsimile. I guess you can't facsimile Miracle Man.
Yeah.
Who knows?
I do want a quick aside. I've seen a number of people talk about, like, I can't believe Miracle Man hasn't been a big hit. I'm like, I absolutely can believe Miracle Man can't be a hit. That was an impossible comic to find that people loved in the 80s. And, like, frankly, like, the audience...
It's not dated well.
Oh, I haven't read it, yeah, so I can't speak to that.
It's not dated well, but also, I have a thing. I love the Beatles. I love the Beatles a lot. I have many close friends who love music who cannot get into the Beatles because they heard everything that ripped off the Beatles first. And so they go back to the Beatles and they're like, oh, this sounds like X, Y, Z. And I think Miracle Man suffers the same thing. It's impossible for a modern reader now to read Miracle Man without going, oh, I've read this scene in this comic. I've read this scene in this comic. Why is this meant to be important again? I've read all this before.
I know everything about Miracle Man because I read Wizard magazine when I was a kid. I'm like, do I really need to actually read Miracle Man versus Kid Miracle Man?
Have you never read Miracle Man?
No, dude, I haven't read Sandman. I haven't read Sandman.
What?
You know what?
How have you not read Sandman?
Everyone's got their strengths, man. I can't read everything. I got all of this.
Okay, now I'm curious. Have you read Love and Rockets? Okay.
I'm pointing at Love and Rockets.
I was going to say, that's a very visual cue.
Yeah. So whenever I see people talking about that, I'm like, of course this comic isn't selling. I mean, like, this audience is for, like, people who read Wizard magazine when they're 9 and couldn't afford $500 single issues. So like, that's pretty much the totality of the audience.
Yeah, it's the weirdest thing. And seeing people now being like, I can't believe that the Mark Buckingham, Neil Gaiman continuation is not a bigger deal. Why would it be a bigger deal? It's part 5 of a 6-part story where no one's read parts 1 through 4. Like, what? Why would you think that people are going to get excited over this?
Yeah.
It literally is a comic that comes with homework. Why would people get excited about it?
Yeah, it's amazing. Okay, I don't have a lot more. Let's bring up one more thing. In terms of prognosticating, and this is not a hot take, I actually think that the Image has at low-key had a really good year. I don't know if you've read Knights. Knights is an amazing comic.
I haven't, but I saw you talking about it, and I was like, oh.
I mean, like, that comic has got, like, 2012 to 2014 peak of its powers, hot streak Image vibes. It's really good. And it's got, like...
Wait, are we in a revival now? Are we in a revival for Image comics of a decade ago?
No. I'm just saying that, like, if that came out during then, it would have been a massive hit. And also, it's got, like, manga vibes, so I feel like people would really... If that actually finds a way to, like, continue its life and they, like, put it in digest editions, I could see that book popping. What I was going to bring up, though, is like, I think this is my non-hot take. I think the Power of Fantasy is going to be a massive hit.
I really hope it's going to be massive. I wonder if the market is such that it will find its audience quickly.
I think it's the perfect storm.
I think it might have to wait until its first collection.
I can see that. I think it's going to be one of those books that comes out, it does pretty well in its first issue. Second and third issues drop off a bit, but then by 4 and 5, it's back up to around number 1. And then the first trade is going to pop. I just think that is something like Kieran has been building. Kieran Gillen is writing it, and art by Casper Vanguard. And Casper's coloring himself. And then who's lettering it?
It's Hassan, isn't it?
Is it Hassan? It's Hassan.
I say that. It might be Clayton, because Kieran does work with Clayton a lot.
No, it is Clayton. It is Clayton Coles. It's Clayton Coles. And so I think that book is really going to pop because Kieran's coming off of Krakoa. He's built up this audience. He's all of his learnings from that. He's poured into that. And like, I brought this up when he came on the podcast the last time. I think his works are kind of almost in like a conversation with each other where he kind of like swings back and forth. And every time he builds up, he's a little stronger than last time. And I think that book is going to be great. And I think that Image is in a position where they could really put a lot of weight behind it. I don't know what that's going to look like. That's the thing is like...
Well, promotion is so confusing right now. How do you promote that book?
I don't know if they're going to do returnability because there's a lot of skepticism about how returnability actually has an impact. But I think if they play their cards right, I think that book could become maybe not saga, but it could become like a top seller that they really need.
I think it has the potential to be Saga or more than Saga, weirdly enough.
Dude, Saga is really big, real big.
I know. But I do think that it has the potential to be more than Saga. I'm saying that, and Kieran is 100% going to send me hate mail for saying that. Like, why would you put that? Why would you put that curse on me?
At least it wasn't Alan Moore doing it.
I talked to Kieran about Power Fantasy in Emerald City. Like, not publicly, like, we, off the record we talk. And everything he told me about that book made me think, oh, this is going to be my favorite comic ever.
Yeah.
He said his works are in conversation with each other. It feels very much like all the lessons he learned on his second go around with Marvel, but in service of a bigger idea. And an idea that could only be a creator-owned book, and honestly could only be a Kieran book. And I think that really does have the potential to be massive if given the chance.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're in a space where superhero comics or superhero stories, because we are talking about worlds where, the TV shows and the movies matter. The tropes are so understood. The tropes are so familiar to people outside of comics that by playing on those tropes and by pointing out those tropes are inherently ridiculous, but not doing so in a snide way, not doing so in a snarky way, not like I love The Boys TV show a lot, right? But The Boys TV show is in large part all this stuff is dumb. Like that's not how the real world works. All this stuff is dumb, and we are going to point out that it is dumb and you are dumb for liking it. And again, I say that as a fan of the show because this stuff is dumb, right? I think that what Kieran is going to do with Power Fantasy is almost the opposite of that. It's going to ironically be a Miracle Man approach, right? Which was when Moore started Miracle Man or Marvel Man at the time. It was, I love superhero comics. Superhero comics have lots of great ideas in them. But what if a real person wandered into a superhero comic? And I think that Gillen's going to do something like that.
I think it's going to be great. Do you have time for one very quick question, theoretically?
I have time for one very quick question, yes.
Okay. The last question for you is, because we've talked about things that are happening now and things that, Power Fantasy is like looking into the future a little bit. You are an editor. You are a man of power now at Popverse.
I'm an editor.
What is one thing that has you excited as we head into the second half of the year?
I'm going to give the cop-out answer, but it's also the genuine answer. I am looking forward to going to San Diego. I'm looking forward to going to New York, and I'm looking forward to finding things that I don't know exist. In the last 10 years of me doing this, the most life-affirming, career-affirming, everything-affirming experience I've had was being a judge for the Eisners in 2018. Not for the being the judge part, because that is an experience all on its own, and it's frustrating and wonderful and everything. But because as part of that, I got to read so many things I didn't know existed. And I found so many things that spoke to me in a way that my quote-unquote favorites didn't. And I came away utterly re-energized by comics as a medium and comics as an industry and the potential that is in both, right? And ever since then, every single year, the thing I'm looking forward to most is finding something that I'm not going to see coming, that is going to slap me upside the head and make me look at everything else differently again.
I love it. That's all we can hope for. I didn't expect to love Knights. I didn't even know Knights existed a month ago, and that was the most excited I've been reading a comic in a while. I'm looking forward to you finding your Knights. But Graeme, that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast to talk about where things are, Krakoa, Speedball, and everything else. I appreciate you taking the time.
It's a Speedball episode. It really is. Thank you for inviting me on.
This episode is definitely involving Speedball in the title. That is a lock. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with Popverse's editor, Graeme McMillan. You can find his work on Popverse and him on Blue Sky. Big thanks to Deanna Chapman for stepping in to edit this episode. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @sketchcomic or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including John Neesmith, John Auerbach, Dustin Weaver, Ninja Assassin Love Story webcomic, Brandon Heyman, Aiden Hammond, Kenny Myers, JKJ Art, Faith Aaron Hicks, IEAC Comics, Ben Rowe, Cameron Brown, Jonathan Breen, Danny Ollie, Charlie Stickney, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Travis Gibb, Darcy Van Polgees, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian Hold, Near Levy, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Django Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Domstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Hoyle, Isaac Oren, Keeps and Tights Podcast, Klaus Vandeven, Subman Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Mazzella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillis, Patrick Power, Declan Shalvey, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Leona Kingus, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Stefan Hull, Philip Myra, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwad, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Plato, Matthew Groom, Jason Nassie, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Brawley, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Adam Highfill, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off-Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out the music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.